Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. When I moved back to New Jersey, my sister Holly and I thought it was perfect timing. She just bought a mother-daughter house on the edge of the Pine Barrens, and with her downstairs, it felt like a step back into the past, a bit like when we were kids, and I'd always felt safe with her nearby. The setup worked out well, especially since Holly was often with her boyfriend, Mason. I had the upstairs apartment, and she had the downstairs. Each of us had our own space, even our own kitchens. Holly liked it that way, and so did I, to be honest. I was a bit of an introvert, and enjoyed my quiet, especially since I mostly worked from home. One night, around the end of October, I decided to kick back with a horror movie. The house was almost too quiet with Holly gone, and I hadn't heard from her in days, but that wasn't unusual. I could still feel the October chill sneaking in through the old windows, even though I'd turned the heat up. Wrapped in a blanket, I settled into the corner of my couch, trying to convince myself that I wasn't as freaked out as I felt. I know it sounds silly, but I kept glancing behind me during the movie. I'm sure it was just the usual paranoia that comes from sitting in a dark room with a scary movie playing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was just beyond my line of sight. The open layout of my living room didn't help. It was too easy for shadows to blend in, especially as the lights from the screen cast strange shapes on the walls. When the movie ended, I felt drained and a little embarrassed. It was just a movie, I reminded myself, turning off the lights. Everything was quiet as I made my way to bed. But once I was in bed, I drifted off almost immediately. I didn't expect to wake up, but a little after 1 a.m. I did. At first, I couldn't understand why. I thought maybe I'd heard something in my dream, but then I heard it again, Holly's voice. She was calling my name. Harris? Her voice was muffled but clear enough. It was coming from downstairs, like she was standing in the hallway. Still half asleep, I figured she must have come home. Maybe she was arguing with Mason. She never yelled, but something about her tone sounded tense, almost urgent. I forced myself out of bed and stumbled into my slippers, heading downstairs to check on her. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked into the darkened kitchen, switching on the dim light over the stove. "Holly?" I called, keeping my voice low. I didn't want to startle her. No answer. I moved closer to her bedroom, feeling like a bit of an idiot for being so cautious in my own house. I glanced into her room, expecting to see her there, maybe even asleep. But the bed was made, and everything was untouched, as if no one had been there at all. "Holly?" I called again, louder this time, as I strained to listen. Then came a low thud from the far end of the room, just near the closet. I froze. The sound wasn't loud, but in the silence, it felt deafening. Every nerve in my body told me to turn around and get out, but I stayed, hoping maybe she just dropped something. "Hello?" I said again, barely a whisper. Nothing. I didn't wait any longer. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to deal with it alone, especially not in the middle of the night. I hurried back up the stairs, my heart pounding, feeling like I'd just narrowly escaped something I couldn't even explain. Once I was safely back in my apartment, I locked my door and grabbed my phone, dialing Holly's number. It rang once, twice, but she didn't pick up. I tried again, hoping she'd answer, but nothing. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, replaying the events over and over in my mind. I wanted to believe it was just exhaustion or a trick of my imagination, but I knew that sound was real. The next morning, I finally drifted off into a fitful sleep, only to wake up to a text from Holly around 7 a.m. "Why did you call me at 1 a.m.? she'd written. My fingers felt numb as I read the message. I texted back, asking if she'd been home, hoping somehow she'd forgotten and made the noise without realizing it. "No," she replied, almost immediately. "I was at Mason's all night." "Why? Did something happen?" I stared at my phone for a long time, unsure how to explain. Instead of going back downstairs right away, I waited until later in the day, around noon, when the sunlight streamed in through the windows and everything felt normal again. I checked her room, searching for anything that could have made the thud. But there was nothing out of place, nothing that could explain what I'd heard. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. My name is Jude, and I was 14 years old, a year shy of the freedom I believed came with being a teenager. But that night, home alone felt more like a prison than a haven. My mother worked as a nurse, a demanding job that kept her away from home for long stretches. I understood the necessity of her work, especially in our small town, where every healthcare worker seemed essential. But as she left for yet another overnight shift, the weight of her absence settled heavily on my shoulders. I was used to being alone. It was part of our routine. But tonight, I had invited my friend Cora over to keep me company. We laughed, sprawled across my bed, surrounded by pillows and snacks, watching the latest horror flicks. It was all in good fun until the clock struck midnight, and Cora decided it was time to head home. I walked her to the door, a mix of reluctance and excitement in my chest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silver beams across our quiet neighborhood, the kind of night that felt eerie even with the stars twinkling above. As Cora left, I closed the door behind her and returned to my room, flipping on the TV once more. The glow of the screen enveloped me, the sounds of screaming and chaos echoing in the stillness of the house. I was safe. I was sure of it. After all, I was just a kid watching movies in the safety of my own home. But then, something changed. It started as a faint sound, a scratching, a dragging. I paused the movie, straining to hear better. Was it the wind? I shook my head, dismissing the thought. I glanced out of my bedroom window, which faced the backyard. The darkness outside was thick, almost tangible, but I could just make out the outline of our deck. That's when I saw him. A man sat in one of our deck chairs, shrouded in shadow, his body rigid and still. The moonlight flickered across his face, illuminating features that were twisted in an unsettling grin. I blinked, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. He seemed to be staring right at me, his eyes glinting in the dark, fixed with an intensity that made my heart pound. Panic washed over me like a cold wave. I ducked out of view, my mind racing. Was this some sort of sick joke? I grabbed my phone and texted Cora, my fingers trembling as I typed. "Did you leave something? There's a guy outside." Her response came almost immediately. "No way! Are you serious?" I could hear the disbelief in her words. I texted a few other friends, hoping one of them would say it was a prank. But each reply echoed Cora's confusion, leaving me more unsettled. Swallowing hard, I glanced back out the window. The man was still there, unyielding, his face obscured by the shadows of the night. I gathered what little courage I had left and called out. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his laughter echoed through the silence, a dry, wheezing sound that sent chills racing down my spine. It wasn't the kind of laugh that would belong to someone normal. It was distorted, almost otherworldly. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to convince myself I was dreaming. But I wasn't. The laughter faded into the stillness, replaced by an unnerving whistling that pierced the night air, like a haunting lullaby. I clutched my phone tightly, but fear immobilized me. What if I called the police? What would I say? "There's a man on my deck?" They'd laugh. They'd think I was being silly. Instead, I retreated to my bed, pulling the covers up over my head as if that could shield me from the horror lurking outside. I told myself he would leave, that he'd get bored and go away. I tried to focus on the muffled sounds of the TV, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart and the eerie silence of the house. Minutes dragged on, or maybe it was hours, I couldn't tell. I glanced at the clock. It was past 1 a.m. I couldn't hear anything except the buzzing silence and the low thrum of the movie playing in the background. Then came a loud crash from the back door, rattling the house and my sanity. I froze. The man was trying to force the door open. What should I do? Call for help? I couldn't. I couldn't make a sound. What if he heard me? I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just my imagination, that I was trapped in one of the horror movies we had watched earlier. But deep down, I knew this was all too real. The sounds shifted. I heard footsteps moving around the house. He was at the front door now, jiggling the handle with a persistence that made my stomach turn. The world outside my window was a dark abyss, but his laughter echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that he was there, and I was alone. Time seemed to blur. Each second felt like a lifetime. Each creak of the house was deafening in the silence. I thought about the things I would do differently. If I had called the police, if I had screamed, if I had done anything but sit there paralyzed by fear. Then, just as abruptly as it began, the sound stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of the man outside. Maybe he'd given up? Maybe he was gone. I waited, counting the seconds, but the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I dared to peek out from under the covers, my heart racing. The moonlight spilled into my room, casting shadows that danced across the walls. I looked out the window again, my heart racing. The deck was empty. The chair was still, the space he occupied now vacant, just a memory of the horror I had just experienced. But what if he was still out there? I couldn't risk it. I had to get to safety. I clambered out of bed, my legs trembling beneath me. I crept toward the door, listening intently for any sign of life. The house was eerily quiet, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to find my mother. I tiptoed down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards echoing like a gunshot in the silence. As I reached the stairs, I paused, my heart pounding in my ears. I hesitated, my mind racing with thoughts of the man outside, the distorted laughter that still lingered in my mind. Finally, I steeled myself and descended the stairs, careful not to make a sound. I reached the front door and pressed my ear against it, straining to hear anything. Silence. I opened the door slowly, peeking out into the stillness of the night. The cool air wrapped around me, but there was no sign of the man. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped onto the porch, scanning the yard for any sign of danger. Nothing. Just the peaceful hum of crickets and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. But I knew better. With my heart still racing, I dashed back inside, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my phone again and called my mother, my hands shaking. She answered groggily, confusion lacing her voice as she asked what was wrong. I think someone was trying to get in. Please come home. The line went quiet, and I could hear her suddenly awake, her voice sharp and concerned. Stay where you are, Jude. I'll be there as soon as I can. I hung up, glancing at the window one last time. The shadows were shifting, the moonlight casting ominous shapes in the darkness. I waited, my heart thudding painfully in my chest, anxiety clawing at my throat. Minutes felt like hours until finally, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. My mother's car! Relief flooded through me as I rushed to the front door, flinging it open just as she stepped out, worry etched across her face. Mom! I cried, launching myself into her arms. There was a man! He was right there! I pointed toward the backyard, breathless with fear. She pulled me close, her arms enveloping me in warmth and safety. What do you mean? A man? Where? He was on the deck. He was trying to get in. My words tumbled out in a rush, a mix of fear and adrenaline. I was too scared to call the police. I'm sorry! Her expression shifted from worry to anger, a storm brewing in her eyes. You should have called 911, Jude! You can't just sit there and wait. You could have been in serious danger. I knew she was right, and the weight of regret settled heavily in my chest. The fear I felt was real, and it had paralyzed me, keeping me from taking action. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I reflected on that night. I had survived, but the realization of how close I came to danger gnawed at me. I would never look at the shadows outside my window the same way again. In the days that followed, I struggled with what had happened. My mother took extra precautions, installing better locks and security lights, but no amount of preparation could erase the fear that lingered in my mind. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, always glancing over my shoulder. I often replayed the events of that night, imagining different outcomes, questioning my choices. What if I had called the police immediately? What if I hadn't hesitated? Would I have been able to confront my fears rather than letting them consume me? It was a typical autumn evening in 2012, the leaves outside turning brilliant shades of red and gold, swirling down the street as a chilling wind picked up. I remember that night as if it were yesterday, even though I was just 10 years old at the time. What should have been a quiet evening at home turned into a nightmare that would stay with me forever. My older brother, Noah, was 14 and the light of my life. He was the kind of brother who could make me laugh when I felt down, and who always looked out for me, even though he was going through his own teenage struggles. That night, however, he was out with friends. My parents had planned on a fun family night, but all that changed when I heard the doorbell ring, and my mom rushed into the living room, concern etched across her face. "Eli, we have to go!" she called out, her voice tinged with urgency. "Noah's been in an accident." My stomach twisted into knots as the weight of her words sunk in. I barely understood what that meant, but the way her eyes flickered with fear made my heart race. The panic in the air was palpable. My parents rushed to grab my 5-year-old sister, Lily, who was blissfully unaware of the chaos unfolding around her. She was more interested in her teddy bear than anything else. "Eli," my dad said, looking at me with a mixture of worry and reassurance. "You'll be okay here by yourself for a little while, right? Just lock the doors, don't answer to anyone, and we'll be back as soon as we can." "Can't I come?" I pleaded, my voice small and desperate. "No, buddy, you need to stay safe here. We'll call you once we know more." My mom brushed a stray hair behind her ear, her eyes glistening with tears. With that, they rushed out the door, leaving me alone in the house. The quiet felt deafening after their frantic energy. I turned on my favorite video game, hoping to drown out the worry that filled my mind. The characters on the screen danced around in vibrant colors, but my heart wasn't in it. All I could think about was Noah. Was he hurt? Would he be okay? Hours passed, the light outside dimming as the sky transformed into a tapestry of indigo. I kept glancing at the clock, each tick echoing in the silence like a drumbeat. As the minutes crawled by, the fear of being alone slowly began to creep into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around midnight, just when I thought I might finally drift off to sleep, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. I froze, my heart pounding. My parents were supposed to be gone for hours. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, but my voice came out as a whisper, swallowed by the darkness of the house. Silence. I stood up slowly, peering through the hallway towards the living room. The shadows danced along the walls, making it impossible to see clearly. The house felt too big, too empty. I stepped cautiously toward the sound, a nagging feeling in my gut telling me that something was wrong. As I reached the living room, I was struck with a jolt of fear. 3 figures stood in the dark, their silhouettes ominous against the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. I didn't recognize them. My heart raced, pounding in my chest like a wild animal trying to escape. What should I do? I knew I couldn't let them see me. I turned on my heels and sprinted back to my room, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I stumbled toward the closet. I yanked it open and crawled inside, burying myself behind boxes and clothes that hadn't been touched in ages. The smell of dust and old fabric filled my nostrils, and I struggled to stifle the urge to cough. Time seemed to stretch as I sat in the cramped darkness, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The sounds of the intruders floated through the house, soft, unintelligible murmurs and the shuffle of feet against the hardwood floor. I was trapped in my own world of terror, wishing desperately for my family to come home. Then, the footsteps approached my bedroom. My heart sank into my stomach as I realized they were coming for me. I closed my eyes tightly, willing myself to disappear. I could hear the creak of my bedroom door opening, and I held my breath, hoping against hope that they wouldn't find me. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the sound of the intruders breathing. I could hear them moving around, shuffling things on my desk, rifling through my belongings. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, but I couldn't make a sound. I just stayed there, hidden behind the clothes, praying they would leave me alone. After what felt like an eternity, the intruder moved toward the closet. I could hear the soft crunch of the floorboards beneath their weight. They stood there, right outside the door. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, and I held my breath, terrified they would hear me. They paused, then slowly opened the closet door. For a brief moment, I thought I would be discovered. The intruder loomed over me, silhouetted against the faint light. I remained perfectly still, my body frozen in fear, my heart racing as I waited for the worst. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. I could see their shadow moving, but they didn't say anything. They must have just been looking for valuables. Why would they want to hurt me? My mind raced with possibilities as I fought against the urge to scream. Finally, the intruder stepped back, closing the closet door with a soft click. I remained there, paralyzed, not daring to move or breathe. I listened as the footsteps retreated from my room, and the door shut behind them. It was only then that I let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline flooding out of my system, leaving me weak and trembling. An hour passed, maybe more, before I heard the front door open again. My heart leapt in my chest, but this time it was accompanied by the sound of familiar voices. "Eli! We're back!" It was my mom's voice, filled with relief. I didn't wait another second. I scrambled out of the closet, nearly tripping over my own feet as I rushed down the stairs. I found my parents standing in the foyer, worry etched on their faces. "Thank God you're okay," my dad exclaimed, wrapping his arms around me in a fierce hug. "We were so worried." As I pulled back, my eyes darted to the front door, which was left ajar. I could see the flickering porch light casting eerie shadows in the darkness outside. I shivered at the thought of what might have happened if I had been discovered. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My parents exchanged glances, and my mom knelt down to look me in the eye. "There was a break-in while we were gone. They took some things, but we're all safe now." I didn't know what to feel, relief, fear, anger. The chaos of the night swirled around me, a mix of emotions too overwhelming to process. My dad glanced around the living room, his brow furrowing. "We need to call the police," he said. "And we have to make sure everything is locked up tight from now on." I nodded, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. What if the intruder had seen me? What if they had wanted more than just to rob our house? As the police arrived and my parents explained what had happened, I felt like I was in a fog, disconnected from the reality around me. Days turned into weeks, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But I carried the weight of that night with me, a constant reminder of how fragile safety could be. Noah recovered from his accident, but the fear never really left me. I often found myself glancing over my shoulder, always half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the corner of my vision. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside at night sent chills down my spine. I couldn't help but think of the strangers who had invaded my home, their dark figures looming in the shadows. I replayed that moment in the closet over and over, wondering if they had known I was there. The thought of being so close to danger without realizing it haunted me. I learned to check the locks, to be cautious, to never take safety for granted again. I wanted to feel safe in my own home, but the fear had taken root, intertwining itself with my thoughts. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. It's as if that night never truly ended. The shadows remain, waiting patiently in the corners of my mind. I still wonder about that intruder. Did they see me? Were they just looking for valuables, or did they have darker intentions?